In the early 1980s, the streets of Long Beach, California, carried a tension few could name, but everyone could feel. Amidst the palm trees and coastal winds, entire families arrived from a country halfway across the world, survivors of one of the darkest chapters in modern history, the Cambodian genocide. These were people who had witnessed death on a scale few Americans could comprehend. They came to the United States not chasing the American dream, but running from a nightmare. They were the forgotten refugees, dropped into the rough neighborhoods of Southern California, places already claimed by violence, poverty, and survival of another kind. The government had called it resettlement. But for many Cambodian families, Long Beach was not a sanctuary. It was another battlefield, one without bombs, but filled with invisible walls. In these neighborhoods, young Cambodians struggled to find their place. Their parents, haunted by trauma and language barriers, worked endless shifts in factories and restaurants, clinging to the hope of safety. But for the children, the streets became their classroom. They were bullied at school, targeted by Latino and black gangs who saw them as outsiders. Their accents made them easy targets. Their poverty made them vulnerable. Their silence, inherited from trauma, made them invisible. And in that invisibility, anger began to grow. It was not the kind of anger that shouted. It was the quiet, burning kind that waited for an identity, for belonging, for a name. By the mid-1980s, the name began to form. In Long Beach, among clusters of Cambodian youth searching for power in a world that had stripped them of it, small groups started coming together. At first, it wasn't about crime, it was about protection, a brotherhood against the humiliation they endured daily. They called themselves the Tiny Rascal Gang, tiny because many were short, skinny teenagers, rascal because they refused to be silent victims anymore. What began as friendship in the schoolyards and street corners soon turned into something much bigger, a movement of defiance born from pain. But the environment around them did not forgive defiance. Long Beach was already a battleground for established gangs, the Crips, the Bloods, and various Latino crews. For young Cambodians to claim space meant declaring war on forces much larger than themselves. Police reports from that era described sudden spikes in violence involving Asian youth groups. The media didn't understand who they were or why they fought. To them, it was another statistic in an already bloody decade. But to those inside the TRG, it was about respect, about reclaiming dignity that the world had denied them since the day they arrived. One of the earliest TRG members, later interviewed in a California prison, said, "We were tired of being scared. We were tired of seeing our mums cry." That simple sentence carried the weight of a generation. For these kids, survival became synonymous with aggression. They learned the language of the streets faster than English. Hand signs replaced vocabulary, colors replaced culture, loyalty replaced law. As their reputation grew, so did their numbers. The TRG's ranks swelled with young Cambodian Americans, some barely teenagers, others already hardened by juvenile detention. They began carving out territory across Long Beach, using alleyways, abandoned lots, and apartment complexes as meeting points. To outsiders, they were just another gang. But to themselves, they were a family, a distorted reflection of the one war had taken from them. Many had lost fathers to execution, brothers to famine, and homes to fire. Now in America, they built their own kind of home, bound not by blood, but by survival. The shift from defense to offense happened almost inevitably. Protection turned into retaliation, and retaliation turned into identity. Every act of violence reinforced who they were. Every enemy created a sense of unity. Soon, graffiti bearing the letters TRG began appearing across Long Beach, sometimes crudely written, sometimes bold and defiant. It wasn't art, it was a declaration: we exist. Police in Long Beach began to take notice. Reports connected the TRG to assaults, robberies, and later, shootings. They were young but fearless. Officers at the time often admitted they were shocked at the discipline these teenagers showed. The TRG was not chaotic, it was organized. They operated in small cells, moved silently, and retaliated quickly. By the late 1980s, they had already established a reputation as one of the most aggressive Asian American gangs in California. What started in the hallways of schools now spread into entire neighborhoods. Behind the violence, however, lay a deeper story, one that most of America never saw. It was the story of children carrying the trauma of genocide into a new country that never healed them. Sociologists later wrote that the TRG was less about crime and more about the psychology of dislocation, how second-generation refugees turned their inherited pain into rebellion. It was the American dream's mirror image, where hope had rotted into rage. By 1989, the TRG was no longer a rumor whispered in school corridors. It was a name feared across Long Beach and neighboring cities like Stockton, Fresno, and Modesto. They had weapons, cars, and connections. They were not just Cambodian anymore. They began recruiting Laotian, Vietnamese, and other Southeast Asian youths facing similar struggles. What united them was not nationality, but marginalization. In the streets, they were one language, violence, and yet for every act that built their reputation, the cost was higher. Parents buried their sons, schools turned into recruiting grounds, the police escalated patrols, and community leaders pleaded for peace. But the momentum was unstoppable. A generation born in trauma was now defining itself through it. The TRG had become more than a gang. It was an identity, a rebellion, a way to be seen in a society that had looked away. Long Beach, once a place of refuge, had given birth to something the government never planned for, a new kind of power, one built not from politics or wealth, but from the raw instinct to survive. And as the 1990s approached, that power was about to collide with another rising force, the Asian Boyz, sparking a war that would stain the streets in a way that still echoes today. By the early 1990s, the streets of Long Beach had become a silent battlefield. The air was thick with tension, not from the clash of cultures or the sound of politics, but from something far more primal: revenge. What began as neighborhood skirmishes between groups of young Asian Americans soon erupted into one of the most violent rivalries in modern gang history. The Tiny Rascal Gang, born from pain and displacement, now faced a mirror image of itself. The Asian Boyz, a crew just as hungry, just as angry, and just as determined to survive. The irony was almost poetic. Both gangs were formed by the same kind of young men, refugees, outsiders, sons of immigrants who had fled war only to inherit another kind. The Asian Boyz were primarily made up of Vietnamese youths, many of them from Los Angeles and the San Fernando Valley, and like the TRG, they had grown tired of being bullied and ignored. In the beginning, there was no grand plan for a war. There were just rumors, misunderstandings, bruised egos, and wounded pride. A stare in a club, a fight at a party, a shot fired from a passing car. But in gang culture, small sparks ignite large fires. It began around 1990. A member of the Tiny Rascal Gang was shot outside a house party in Long Beach. The whispers said it was the Asian Boyz. No one knew for sure, but in the world of street loyalty, proof wasn't necessary, only belief. Within days, retaliation came. Gunfire ripped through the same neighborhoods that once served as refugee sanctuaries. Windows shattered, families hid on the floor, and the smell of gunpowder replaced the ocean breeze. For the first time, the violence wasn't between Asian and Latino or black gangs. It was Cambodian versus Vietnamese, two communities that shared the same wounds but had turned them against each other. As the 1990s progressed, the feud intensified. The TRG and Asian Boyz war wasn't just about territory, it was about pride. It became a deadly competition for dominance, for identity, for the right to say, "We run this." Long Beach, Fresno, Stockton, and even cities as far north as Seattle felt the ripple effect. Police began to recognize a new kind of violence, organized, tactical, and unapologetically lethal. Detectives described the shootouts as military-style ambushes. The TRG, known for its numbers and structure, often rolled deep. Cars full of armed members, coordinated and quick. The Asian Boyz, smaller but ruthless, responded with precision and fearlessness. Every weekend brought new funerals. In 1992, the war reached national headlines when a TRG member was killed in a public shootout that left bystanders injured. Local news anchors struggled to pronounce the names of those involved, their confusion symbolic of a society that still didn't understand the story unfolding in its own backyard. To the media, it was Asian gang violence. To the kids on the streets, it was survival. One Long Beach police officer later admitted, "We had never seen anything like it. These kids were disciplined, they weren't chaotic, they had structure, and they weren't scared to die." The TRG had evolved beyond a street gang. It was now a movement with its own code of conduct. They didn't just fight for turf. They fought for the memory of every humiliation, every beating, every insult they had ever endured in America. The war with the Asian Boyz became the crucible in which their identity was forged. But inside that fire, humanity burned away. Both gangs lost dozens of members, friends killed friends. Younger recruits, sometimes only 13 or 14 years old, were handed guns and told to put in work. A single act of violence was enough to earn status. One TRG member later said from prison, "It wasn't about money back then. It was about respect. Respect was everything." And yet, in chasing respect, they buried their youth, one bullet at a time. The police crackdown came hard. Task forces were created specifically to target Southeast Asian gangs. Long Beach became a testing ground for new anti-gang strategies, surveillance operations, and RICO-style prosecutions. The FBI began to track connections between TRG sets across state lines, realizing that what started as a local conflict was now spreading nationally. But enforcement didn't slow them down. It only pushed them to evolve. By the mid-1990s, both TRG and Asian Boyz had expanded their presence into multiple states. Washington, Oregon, Massachusetts, and even Texas reported activity. The war in some ways had created its own diaspora, members fleeing prosecution or seeking new territory. In every city they entered, the story repeated itself. A handful of Cambodian or Vietnamese kids, isolated and angry, found belonging under the same letters that had defined their brothers in Long Beach. Inside the prisons, the conflict didn't end, it mutated. Inmates brought the war behind bars, dividing units by gang affiliation. Fights broke out in dining halls and yards, often resulting in lockdowns. Correctional officers learned quickly to separate TRG from Asian Boyz. But even within those walls, something changed. Members on both sides began to recognize that their fight was eating their own. Some older TRG members started questioning what it was all for. "We were fighting ourselves," one said years later. "We came from the same pain." Yet for others, the violence was all they knew. The TRG's reputation grew legendary among Asian American gangs. Their sheer numbers, their unity, their willingness to go to war without hesitation. They had become the archetype of fear and power. Movies and local law began to romanticize them, portraying their members as tragic anti-heroes, survivors of two wars, one in Cambodia and one in California. As the 1990s drew to a close, the bodies had piled high, and both gangs were exhausted. Police pressure, internal betrayals, and prison sentences began to thin their ranks. But the legacy of that decade, of blood in the streets, of revenge and regret, left an imprint on Long Beach that still lingers today. Murals and old graffiti remain as silent witnesses to a time when two groups of broken young men turned their shared trauma into mutual destruction. And yet, from that destruction, something even more dangerous began to rise. The TRG learned from the war. They learned discipline, coordination, and how to move quietly under the radar. They began to trade their open warfare for organization, their bullets for business. The gang that was once born out of anger was about to become something else entirely, a network. The next stage of their evolution would take them far beyond the streets of Long Beach, into new states, new markets, and new forms of power. The age of survival was over. The age of expansion had begun. By the mid-1990s, the Tiny Rascal Gang had outgrown the narrow streets of Long Beach. What began as a cluster of frightened Cambodian American teens seeking protection had now evolved into a sprawling network that crossed city and state borders. The TRG was no longer just a gang, it was a structure, decentralized, yet united under a single identity. Its roots were buried deep in trauma, but its branches were reaching toward power. Law enforcement struggled to understand how fast the transformation happened. In just over a decade, the TRG had gone from schoolyard fights to orchestrated criminal operations. They were spreading like wildfire: Fresno, Stockton, Seattle, Portland, Denver, Houston, even as far as Lowell, Massachusetts. Wherever Southeast Asian refugees had been resettled, TRG found new ground to plant their flag. The migration of their people became the blueprint of their expansion. Members moving with family or to escape police pressure simply carried the name with them. What police saw as relocation was, in reality, the quiet formation of a national web. Each new city adapted the TRG code to its local reality. There was no single leader, no rigid hierarchy. The gang operated more like a federation, united by shared symbols, shared enemies, and shared survival instincts. Their identifying color, gray, became an emblem of neutrality and anonymity. It was the color of asphalt, smoke, and shadows, and it perfectly represented what TRG had become, invisible until it struck. Members began tattooing the number 712 on their arms or hands, a cryptic reference to the letters TRG on a telephone keypad. These tattoos were marks of loyalty, identifiers in prisons and streets alike. The early TRG generation, forged in violence, had learned that chaos attracted police attention. Now they began to refine their methods. Instead of fighting openly, they started controlling. Extortion, weapons trafficking, drug sales, counterfeit checks, and credit card fraud became their primary businesses. They learned to exploit their invisibility, blending into working-class neighborhoods, moving quietly through immigrant communities where the language barrier made police intervention difficult. In many cases, the TRG's criminal economy thrived because their own people feared them but didn't trust law enforcement enough to report them. Investigations in the late 1990s revealed TRG's reach was far more extensive than anyone imagined. The FBI began linking local robberies, home invasions, and drug rings across multiple states to the same gang. What confused authorities was the lack of central command. There was no kingpin to arrest, no pyramid to collapse. TRG operated through small, semi-autonomous cliques, cells that shared loyalty but not dependency. If one fell, others continued. It was a structure learned not from books but from survival. Inside prisons, the network found new depth. Incarcerated TRG members connected across state lines, building bridges between street sets and prison crews. They traded information, contacts, and influence. Prisons, once meant to dismantle gangs, became their communication hubs. Members who served time often came out more disciplined, more strategic, and more respected. The TRG Brotherhood inside institutions like Folsom, San Quentin, and Pelican Bay was feared, not for its numbers, but for its silence. They didn't boast, they didn't talk, they moved like smoke. As the gang expanded geographically, it also diversified racially. While Cambodians remained the core, TRG began recruiting Laotian, Hmong, Vietnamese, and even Filipino youth, anyone who felt alienated or abandoned by the system. Poverty didn't discriminate, and neither did the streets. This inclusivity, rare among gangs, made TRG stronger. It allowed them to adapt culturally in every city they entered. In Texas, they worked with local Hispanic gangs. In Washington, they clashed and later allied with black sets. Their reputation grew not just through violence, but through adaptability. By the early 2000s, TRG had become a ghost presence across the United States. Law enforcement databases listed hundreds of active members, yet only fragments of their operations were understood. They had mastered the art of blending in. Many members held legitimate jobs: mechanics, warehouse workers, truck drivers, by day, while conducting criminal activities at night. Their money flowed through small businesses, fake identities, and underground economies. It was no longer about territorial pride. It was about financial survival and dominance. What made TRG different from traditional gangs like the Crips or the Bloods was their quiet efficiency. They didn't rely on flashy displays of power. Their violence was calculated, not chaotic. When they struck, it was personal, precise, and devastating. This was not the rebellion of angry teenagers anymore. It was organized crime, built from the blueprints of pain. Some criminologists compared TRG's evolution to that of a modern diaspora mafia, a group that turned dislocation into discipline. Their decentralized nature made infiltration nearly impossible. Police could take down one clique in Fresno, but another in Tacoma would continue business as usual. The name Tiny Rascal Gang had become a brand, and every member was both a product and a distributor. Yet, amid this growth, the soul of the TRG darkened further. The young men who once saw themselves as protectors were now predators within their own communities. Families that had once fled genocide now feared their own sons. In Long Beach, where it all began, murals painted by mothers commemorated lost children, victims of the same violence that had defined their fathers' youth. Local churches began forming rehabilitation programs, trying to pull young men out of the cycle, but for many, it was already too late. In one 2003 interview, a former TRG member said, "It started because we were scared. Now, people are scared of us. But that's not power, that's poison." His words captured the paradox of TRG's rise. The same fear that once drove them to fight had now become their weapon and their curse. By the mid-2000s, TRG's name carried weight in cities far removed from Long Beach. Their activities intersected with major criminal enterprises, including ties, both direct and indirect, to Mexican cartels and weapons suppliers in the Southwest. In Houston, investigators linked TRG members to firearms smuggling operations. In the Midwest, others were involved in meth distribution. The gang that began with fists and knives was now trafficking across state lines. But unlike many organizations that collapse under their own size, TRG's loose structure kept them alive. Each new generation reinvented the gang in its own image, sometimes more violent, sometimes more strategic, but always under the same banner. The story of TRG was no longer just about Long Beach. It had become a story of America's shadow network, the places where broken dreams turned into underground empires. As the 2010s approached, the TRG's evolution was nearly complete. What had once been survival had become enterprise. What had once been rebellion had become a business. And as the gang grew more sophisticated, one question began to haunt even its oldest members. Had the struggle for respect become the very thing that destroyed their roots? The answer lay not on the streets of Long Beach anymore, but behind the bars and borders of an empire built from pain. Behind the cold concrete walls of California's prisons, a new version of the Tiny Rascal Gang was born. One quieter, sharper, and far more dangerous. By the late 1990s, law enforcement had cracked down on the streets of Long Beach, Fresno, and Stockton, arresting hundreds of TRG members in sweeping operations. But prison wasn't the end of the gang. It was the beginning of its transformation. Locked inside some of the most violent correctional facilities in the country, TRG members didn't fade into submission. They adapted, reorganized, and redefined what it meant to be a rascal. The streets had taught them to fight. Prison would teach them to rule. Inside institutions like Folsom, Pelican Bay, and San Quentin, gangs ruled the social order. Every race had its alliances and enemies. The Mexican mafia dominated the Latino population. The Aryan Brotherhood enforced the white supremacist code. The Black Guerrilla Family and Crips controlled the black inmates, but the Asian groups were fragmented, often underestimated by both inmates and guards. That changed when the Tiny Rascal Gang began to assert its presence. Their numbers were smaller compared to other racial groups, but their unity, discipline, and willingness to retaliate without hesitation quickly earned them a place of respect and fear. Prison, for TRG, became both a crucible and a university. Here, survival required intelligence as much as brutality. Veteran members who had seen the gang evolve on the streets now found themselves forced to think strategically. They studied how other prison gangs operated, their hierarchies, codes, and methods of communication. TRG adopted what worked and discarded what didn't. They established silent rules: loyalty to the letters, respect above all, no unnecessary words. They began to mimic the organizational efficiency of groups like the Mexican mafia, not through imitation, but adaptation. Communication inside was key. Members used coded letters, hand signs, and even messages hidden in legal paperwork to reach TRG sets on the outside. What once were neighborhood cliques now functioned as extensions of prison politics. A single order passed from behind bars could ripple across multiple states. In some cases, entire street operations paused or shifted based on decisions made in a prison cell. The TRG had evolved into something resembling an invisible council, decentralized, but bound by an unspoken hierarchy shaped by respect and time served. Guards began to notice that TRG inmates rarely acted impulsively. They didn't brawl for sport. Their violence was deliberate. When they struck, it was because a code had been broken or a message needed to be sent. Even rival gangs began to acknowledge their precision. One correctional officer at Folsom Prison later said in an interview, "They're different. They're not loud, but they move like they know everything that's happening around them. They don't need numbers to control a unit. They need presence." Inside, alliances shifted constantly. The TRG often worked with other Asian groups like the Ching or Asian Boyz when survival demanded unity, though old rivalries never fully disappeared. In some prisons, the two groups maintained tense truces, understanding that a war behind bars would only make them vulnerable to larger gangs. Over time, however, the TRG's reputation as the most structured Southeast Asian group in the system gave them influence. They were the ones to contact when other Asian inmates needed protection or negotiation. They had become the de facto power for their community inside the walls. For young members entering prison for the first time, meeting the TRG inside was like joining a secret society. The older inmates, often lifers, acted as mentors and enforcers. They taught newcomers discipline, silence, and respect. Tattoos were earned, not chosen. Every act of loyalty was observed, every betrayal remembered. Some inmates compared it to a spiritual transformation, entering prison as boys, leaving as soldiers. "You go in scared," one former member said years later, "but if you make it into TRG inside, you stop being scared. You belong to something bigger than freedom." That sense of belonging was both powerful and tragic. Many of these men had grown up without fathers, without guidance, without identity. In prison, they found all three, twisted into the structure of a gang. The TRG Brotherhood gave them order in a world that had only offered chaos, but the cost was permanent. Once inside, there was no leaving without consequence. By the 2000s, the TRG's prison network extended beyond California. Members incarcerated in Oregon, Washington, and Texas began replicating the model. The name became synonymous with quiet control. They avoided unnecessary attention, often working through intermediaries in racial politics. If the Mexican mafia wanted a favor from the Asian population, it was usually TRG they approached. If the Aryan Brotherhood wanted to send a message to a Southeast Asian inmate, they did it through TRG channels. In a world built on violence, they had learned the language of diplomacy. Still, the violence never disappeared. It simply evolved. Hits were planned weeks in advance, using coded communication passed between cells. Homemade weapons known as shanks were hidden in ingenious ways. TRG members were known for their patience. They could wait months for the right moment to strike. When they did, it was fast, silent, and absolute. To the guards, it looked like sudden chaos. To the inmates, it was ritual. Outside the walls, this new structure had consequences. Released TRG members brought prison discipline back to the streets. They introduced new codes of silence, new rules, and a new sense of hierarchy. The once chaotic, youthful gang began to mirror the rigid organization of traditional prison syndicates. Money flowed upward, orders flowed downward. The TRG was no longer a street gang. It was a network, fortified by the discipline of incarceration. Yet, beneath this cold efficiency, the human cost deepened. Some TRG members found themselves caught between two worlds, unable to rejoin society, but unwilling to stay in the life. Rehabilitation programs struggled to reach them. Their trauma had calcified into identity. "When you've been inside for years," one ex-member confessed, "freedom feels like another kind of prison. You don't know who you are without the gang." In documentaries and interviews, former law enforcement officials often describe the TRG as a paradox. Violent yet organized, young yet ancient in its methods, fractured yet united by a shared pain. Behind those walls, they had turned their generational trauma into structure, their fear into power, and their isolation into brotherhood. But power always comes with a cost. As the TRG's prison network expanded, it began to influence not just crime, but culture, shaping how Southeast Asian identity was perceived across America. In neighborhoods from Long Beach to Lowell, the legend of the imprisoned rascal became both warning and inspiration. Some admired their loyalty, others feared their shadow. Inside the prisons, the Brotherhood endured, a silent empire built on concrete floors and whispered codes. It was there, in the heart of confinement, that TRG found its truest form. A family forged in captivity, loyal to the end, and bound by the one thing they had always known: survival. By the mid-2000s, the Tiny Rascal Gang had become something few could have predicted when it first formed on the streets of Long Beach 2 decades earlier. What began as a small group of Cambodian American teenagers fighting to survive in a foreign land had transformed into a vast and complex criminal network that operated across multiple states. They were no longer just the scared kids defending themselves against bullies. They were now the ones who inspired fear. The TRG had become an empire, built not on territory or ideology, but on money, fear, and identity. Their operations were no longer limited to gang wars and street fights. The TRG had matured into a structure with multiple income streams: drugs, weapons, extortion, fraud, and identity theft. Their power wasn't loud or visible. It moved through quiet channels, hidden beneath the surface of everyday life. Small businesses across California, Oregon, and Washington unknowingly served as fronts for TRG activity. Laundromats, car repair shops, used car lots, and even nail salons became cash washing machines for illicit profits. Their model was simple: stay invisible, stay profitable, and never draw too much heat. This evolution reflected something deeper than greed. For many TRG members, money became a symbol of transformation, proof that they could rise above the poverty and rejection that had defined their families' lives. The same kids whose parents had fled genocide now drove luxury cars, wore gold chains, and posted photos on social media, flaunting the success their parents had never dreamed of. But beneath that surface glamour was a constant paranoia, a gnawing sense that everything could collapse in an instant. In TRG's world, power came not from wealth itself, but from the fear it commanded. Fear was their true currency. On the streets, the mere mention of TRG carried weight. In Long Beach, elders whispered the name with a mix of dread and pity. Young Southeast Asians who grew up in poor neighborhoods saw the gang as both a threat and a temptation, a chance to belong, to earn respect, to escape invisibility. The TRG didn't have to recruit anymore. Reputation did the work for them. Every shooting, every headline, every whispered story of revenge reinforced the myth. And myths, in the world of the disillusioned, are more powerful than truth. By the late 2000s, TRG's involvement in drug trafficking had expanded significantly. Methamphetamine became one of their primary commodities, distributed through connections that stretched from California's Central Valley to the Midwest. They partnered with other gangs and even tapped into networks linked to Mexican cartels for supply. Some members handled street-level sales, others operated as mid-tier distributors, earning steady profits while keeping their hands clean. This diversification made them resilient. When one operation fell, another quietly took its place. The TRG had learned the art of redundancy, a lesson born in the chaos of their early years. Meanwhile, fraud became an equally lucrative pillar of their empire. TRG members developed expertise in counterfeit checks, credit card cloning, and identity theft, crimes that required precision and intelligence, not just muscle. In an era when law enforcement still struggled to track cybercrime, these schemes thrived. A single TRG cell could generate thousands of dollars in a week using stolen identities, fake driver's licenses, and online purchases resold for cash. These operations were quiet, efficient, and hard to trace. The perfect evolution for a gang that had learned to live in the shadows. Money brought influence. Members began buying properties, investing in businesses, and sending money back to families in Cambodia. In some Southeast Asian communities, this wealth blurred moral lines. Parents who once feared the TRG now accepted help from them. Churches received donations from men who carried guns beneath their suits. The same gang that had terrorized neighborhoods was now financing them, funding events, sponsoring local sports teams, and showing up at community gatherings with polite smiles and crisp bills. For a brief moment, the TRG appeared almost respectable, until the next body dropped, reminding everyone of the price of their prosperity. But with power came fragmentation. Different TRG sets across the country began operating independently, sometimes even turning on one another. In some cities, greed replaced brotherhood. The younger generation, raised in the digital era, cared less about loyalty and more about profit. They flaunted their money online, revealing details that older members had spent years keeping hidden. The code of silence that once defined TRG was breaking. Law enforcement took notice. Federal investigations began linking TRG members to larger organized crime networks. In 2011, the FBI and local police executed coordinated raids across multiple states, arresting dozens of members for crimes ranging from murder to credit card fraud. For the first time, the gang's decentralized nature, once its greatest strength, became a weakness. Isolated cells were easier to dismantle when they operated without coordination. Yet even as law enforcement celebrated each wave of arrests, the gang adapted, regrouped and regenerated. TRG's structure was too fluid, too organic to kill completely. What kept it alive wasn't leadership, it was identity. For many members, being part of TRG was not just a choice, but a heritage. It was a lineage passed down through cousins, brothers and friends. Kids growing up in rough neighborhoods, surrounded by poverty and disconnection, saw the gray bandanas and 712 tattoos as symbols of belonging. It wasn't just a gang, it was a culture. They spoke the same slang, wore the same colors, and carried the same pride, a twisted kind of nationalism born in exile. The irony of TRG's empire was that it was built from the very pain it caused. Every act of violence reaffirmed their myth, every arrest added to their legend. The streets told stories of loyalty and betrayal, of men who rose from nothing only to lose everything. The gang's evolution mirrored the immigrant experience itself, the hunger for respect, the pursuit of stability, and the constant fear of erasure. Sociologists studying the TRG often described it as a self-fulfilling prophecy of displacement. Its members had inherited trauma from war and turned it into organization, discipline, and power. But in doing so, they had also inherited the same cycles of loss and suffering that their parents once fled. Their empire was not just criminal, it was psychological, emotional, generational. By the 2010s, TRG's influence could be felt across both coasts of the United States. They had built an underground economy powered by fear and sustained by loyalty. Yet, as their power grew, so did their contradictions. They were protectors who had become predators, survivors who had become oppressors, and sons who had become the very threat their parents once ran from. The TRG empire was a reflection of everything America had given and taken from them: freedom, opportunity, and the unrelenting hunger to matter. And in the years to come, as some members aged and others sought redemption, that hunger would confront its final test: the price of their legacy. Every empire leaves a shadow, and for the Tiny Rascal Gang, that shadow stretched across decades, etched into the streets of Long Beach and beyond. By the time the 2010s arrived, the TRG had already become more than a gang. It was a symbol. To some, it represented resilience, the story of young men who refused to remain invisible. To others, it was a reminder of how trauma, left unhealed, can turn into destruction. Either way, its presence lingered. In the murals, the prison yards, the broken families, and the whispered stories passed from one generation to the next. The TRG's rise to power had been brutal, but its price was even heavier. For the first generation, those who had founded the gang in the 1980s, age brought perspective, and perspective brought ghosts. Many of them were now in their 40s or 50s, serving long sentences or trying to rebuild their lives after years behind bars. They had once fought to protect their neighborhoods, but those same streets now belonged to ghosts of their own making. The corners they once ruled were quieter now, patrolled not by rival gangs, but by memories. Some ex-members described walking through Long Beach years later and feeling like strangers in a place they had once died for. "It's weird," one said in an interview. "Back then, every block had meaning. Now it's just concrete and ghosts." The younger generation, those who came after the gang's peak, inherited the mythology, but not the purpose. For them, TRG was a brand more than a brotherhood, something to wear, post, or tattoo. The discipline that once defined the gang's older members had eroded into impulsive violence. Social media glorified the lifestyle, turning past bloodshed into aesthetic rebellion. Videos of young TRG members flashing hand signs, waving guns, and rapping about loyalty flooded online platforms, distorting what had once been a desperate form of survival into entertainment. The real weight of the past, the funerals, the mothers' tears, the broken families, was lost beneath filters and beats. Meanwhile, the communities that had birthed the TRG were still paying the cost. The Cambodian American population of Long Beach, one of the largest outside of Cambodia itself, had spent decades fighting to rebuild its reputation. Parents who once fled genocide now had to explain to their children why their last names appeared in gang databases, why their cousins had been deported, or why their uncles were never coming home. The same trauma that had pushed the first generation into violence continued to haunt the second and third. Not through war, but through cycles of poverty, broken education, and criminalization. Deportation became one of the cruelest ironies of the TRG story. Under U.S. immigration law, non-citizens convicted of serious crimes could be deported, even if they had arrived as refugees, even if they had lived in America their entire lives. Starting in the late 1990s, hundreds of Cambodian American gang members, including many from TRG, were deported to Cambodia, a country most of them had never seen, whose language they barely spoke. There, they were treated as outsiders once again. Phnom Penh and Siem Reap began to see the rise of small TRG cliques, their tattoos and grey bandanas standing out in the humid streets. They brought with them the codes of the American underworld: loyalty, respect, retaliation, but in a land still healing from its own wounds. In a tragic twist of history, the children of refugees had become the exiled. Back in the United States, some former TRG members tried to break the cycle. Programs like the Cambodian Town Peace Project and local church groups began reaching out to ex-gang members, helping them reintegrate into society. Some found redemption through mentorship, speaking to younger generations about the illusions of gang life. One former TRG member, known only as Van, became a youth counselor in Long Beach. "We thought we were protecting our people," he said, "but we were just continuing the war our parents escaped." His words resonated across a community trying to heal, a reminder that every act of violence carried the echo of history. Law enforcement, too, began to see the TRG story as a lesson in complexity. For years, they had treated the gang as just another criminal organization, but researchers and sociologists painted a deeper picture of young men shaped by trauma, displacement, and poverty whose rage was never random. It was generational. Studies published in the 2010s described how the legacy of war trauma, family silence, and cultural dislocation had fused into a cycle of violence that the justice system was unequipped to break. The TRG was not born from greed or ideology. It was born from pain. And until that pain was addressed, others would follow the same path. Still, for all the academic understanding and community activism, the damage remained tangible. There were mothers who would never see their sons again, brothers who grew old behind bars, and neighborhoods that still flinched at the sound of a car backfiring. The graffiti faded over time, but the fear did not. In the eyes of many older Cambodians, the TRG represented a wound that had never fully closed, a scar between generations. For the youth, however, it was also a complicated symbol, both a warning and a memory of pride in a world that had refused to see them. By the 2020s, the TRG was no longer the dominant force it once was. Law enforcement pressure, mass incarcerations, and changing social dynamics had fractured the organization. Some sets remained active in California, Washington, and Massachusetts, but the scale had diminished, yet their influence, their legend, persisted. Pop culture, documentaries, and online forums kept their story alive, often romanticizing the gang's origins without understanding the full cost. The TRG had become an urban myth, a ghostly reminder of what happens when trauma turns into identity. In one of his final interviews before deportation, an older TRG member summed up the tragedy simply, "We were born from war, we became the war, and now we live with it." His words encapsulated the entire arc, from refugees to rebels, from rebels to rulers, from rulers to relics. The price of power was not measured in money or territory, but in memory, in the faces of those lost along the way. Today, Long Beach stands transformed. The same streets that once echoed with gunfire now host Cambodian festivals, family-run restaurants, and murals celebrating survival. But beneath the music and color, the story of the TRG lingers, not as a glorification, but as a warning. It's the story of what happens when a generation inherits pain without healing, when belonging comes at the cost of peace, and when power grows from fear instead of hope. The Tiny Rascal Gang began as a cry for recognition, and it ended as a reflection of everything America promised and everything it failed to deliver. Their legacy is not just written in police reports or court documents, but in the lives of those who still search for identity in the space between two worlds. In the end, TRG's greatest tragedy wasn't that it rose from violence. It's that it never learned how to live without it. If this story moved you, don't let it fade into silence. Hit like if you believe stories like these deserve to be told. Comment below. What part of TRG's story shocked you the most? Subscribe to our channel for more real-life documentaries exposing hidden histories of power, identity, and survival. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next episode, because every week we uncover another truth buried beneath the streets. Together, let's remember where pain began and what it became.